Hello, everyone. So we're going to get started. We're pretty much going to do a quick summary on the origins of the gangster genre. But before we get started, we also have to talk a little bit about the history over the origins of Hollywood or the American film entertainment. Be referencing Gangsters on the Screen by Frank Manchel. So pretty much he does a good job in presenting the history of the gangster genre. There's a reason why we consider the gangster genre to be an American genre, and that's because pretty much the American film industry and the gangster genre pretty much took off around the same time. So this is around the 1900s. Again, there's no exact date for when film started. Film is something that has been evolving. There's no known start date, right? Because film pretty much started with moving pictures, right? And then that turned into something else when technology around film continued to advance, right? So that's when film went from being 1 second long to being shown 1 minute to 5 minutes to an hour long. So that it's something that's constantly evolving, as well as sound, right? There's movies and film that were made without sound. But when sound was incorporated, that added another layer of storytelling, right? So film itself has continued to evolve, and there's no exact known date of when film actually started, right? The same thing with the gangster genre. There's no exact date of when it started, but some people tend to say that the first gangster movie came out in 1906 with The Black Hand. But again, some other films that could be considered gangster films came out pre 1906. We're going to start in the 1900s, right? So around this time, there was a lot of makeshift home theaters or tents where some people would grab film and pretty much show it. It was a cheap form of entertainment because in those days, a lot of entertainment was live, so it was more expensive and it was more access to people that had money, right? So to go into one of these shows, you had to pretty much pay for the actors, the lighting, the live music, the costuming, right? So all this added up to the cost of the ticket. But when film came along, you film something once and you could just make extra copies, and those copies of films people could take and show all over the country in small makeshift theaters like the one you see on the right. That just led to more Americans having access to this sort of affordable form of entertainment, right? So, but that's a quick history of film. But again, why was the gangster genre so popular, right? So around this time, we see that it became popular. Why? Because part of the audience of the gangster genre was immigrants, right? So during this time, there was a lot of immigrants that were coming from other countries like Italy, Ireland, and so these people didn't feel the protection of government, right? It was a time where the migrants felt like there was a lot of corruption, like government was against them. They were imposing a lot of strict regulations against them, and there was no sort of representation, right? So it was this frustration that was building up in the the ghettos or in areas that weren't being represented, and they felt like the government was just exploiting the weak, right, and really just taking care of the rich. Another aspect of frustration came from a lot of lonely men, right? So a lot of migrants tend to be men, and of course, with that comes areas that are known for prostitution, for drugs, for gambling, right? So a lot of people, a lot of poor people were mixed into that sort of world. And again, along with no faith in politicians, there was no faith in law enforcement. They felt like law enforcement was looking the other way. They were receiving bribes from criminals in the neighborhoods, or they were just extorting the people that they're supposed to be protecting, right? So this pretty much is what led to a lot of frustration, right? But there was potential with this new technology called film, and they were pretty much thinking, what's the best way to profit and pretty much make as much money as possible, right? So it's finding a subject, finding a theme that general public could want to see, the general public wants to pay for, and pretty much make money off of the subject and just keep repeating it. So that subject pretty much turned out to be crime and violence, right? A lot of people were talking about the crime and the violence. They would read it in newspapers, they would see it in their day-to-day life, but they felt like nobody was really doing anything about it, right? That sense of being disenfranchised, being alone. And so as they saw that these stories were showing up in the newspaper, they pretty much adapted a lot of these stories into film. So again, this is early 1900s. 1910, there was more people adopting this new technology, which was film, and more people were pretty much getting used to going and watching these short length. Again, around this time, the film still had no sound. It was still pretty short in length. So we pretty much see how in Europe the infrastructure was collapsing due to World War One. That meant that there was no investment in developing any sort of films, or there was no people weren't going out to the theaters during a world war, right? However, in the United States, times were kind of turning around. There was more investment in this new technology. So you see on the right, the 1916 set for intolerance, right? So the United States was pretty much investing in these bigger structures, these big sets to sort of give audiences and the American people a distraction for what their lives were. So we start to see by 1917, there's more of a monopoly that's starting to develop in Hollywood, and that pretty much means that studios want to where the films are being showed, when they're made, and the money that's generated from them could go back into the studios, right? So that's how Hollywood pretty much became the film capital of the world. Again, it was during the time of it was during the time of the First World War, more investment in this new technology called film, and the decay in Europe pretty much meant that they had no competition, right? The Europeans couldn't be making film during a world war, and that's what pretty much took advantage of that head start and pretty much funneled a lot of money into creating these sets. Again, what is the origin of the gangster film? This was typically around the time of the Great Depression, casting gangsters as heroes and creating a new film genre to symbolize the decay of American society, right? So we fast forward a little bit more. We're now in the 1920s. And what happens? Things like prohibition come into effect, where again the government decides to limit alcohol in the United States, which again leads to frustration by the people. But also they start to see how so this pretty much causes a market for organized crime to pretty much give the people what they want, right? So in this case, if alcohol's prohibited, then organized crime is going to try and control and supply or fill that demand. So that's when you start to see more examples of organized crime. to supply not only drugs but also alcohol, prostitution, gambling, and that's leads to more um, more stories coming out in the newspaper, more more examples of corruption by government, by police. And so this anger that we see in the early 1900s only grows to a new level because of prohibition and because of the post World War One society of government and law enforcement not really caring about the common American, right? So that's when you pretty much see a boom in the gangster film genre. So in what we see in the 1931 to 1933, 60 gangster films are developed, right? So these are characters that have it all. These are characters that come from the same background that a lot of the audience members come from. These are characters that um, usually have an immigrant backstory, and then we have movies like Little Caesar and Public Enemy and Scarface. These are all stories that were coming out in the early 1930s. So we see this boom and this change of what we see the criminal as, right? It used to be this hoodlum pre World War One, but after, right, in the 1930s, this gangster image is refined from being rough and street like to being more a man of society, a man that could navigate both the streets and high class, right? And at the same time, with the increase in production of these films, there was also a fear that a lot of the youth could be corrupted, right? So there's always been this challenge between censorship and freedom of speech, right? So we start to see the early development of um, the Hayes censorship rules, and it's again to sort of try and control the message that these gangster movies are gonna impose in the youth and the next generation. And so, what are pretty much the five pillars of why the gangster genre was created, right? So again, the first is immigrants, right, or migrants, people that were coming to the country. They felt disenfranchised, didn't feel like they belonged into the society that didn't want them, this society that mistreated them, and a lot of them were coming from poor countries and priests of the gangster genre. And one of the first legs is immigrants that came into the country that didn't feel the support of this new country. They felt the hatred that they received from the general American population. And so a lot of them felt unhappy and unease, right? The second one was the mistrust in government. Not only by not only did immigrants mistrust the government, the Americans themselves at the time felt like due to prohibition, due to the Great Depression that was happening, um, and the World War, there was no real security that government was providing. They felt like there was a lot of corruption that was happening at the time. And that is the same thing with law enforcement, right? Members of law enforcement were picking on people from these poor areas, and there was a lot of anger and frustration with members of law enforcement that were receiving bribes from these organized groups that were um, selling drugs, selling alcohol, right? So a lot of the general population felt like law enforcement was corrupt. And again, another leg is affordable entertainment. In the past, audiences had to pay a more expensive price to go look at a live show, but now with this new technology, they're able to pay less and get entertained by going to um, a makeshift movie theater or then going to an actual movie theater. It just became more affordable, right? So another aspect is the advancement of technology, right? So movies went from being 1 second to 1 minute to 5 minutes to 10 minutes. and it just became evolving, right? The incorporation of sound and music um, just added a new layer of storytelling, right? We're gonna fast forward, right? So pretty much studio executives took advantage of the frustration, the anger, the disappointment that the people had, and pretty much greenlit a bunch of projects, right? So in 1930 to 1933, there was more than 60 gangster films that were being generated, right? And we're gonna see that that's the same formula that studios do throughout the decades. It happened in the 30s, it happened in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and we're going to fast forward to the 90s, right? So the 90s was another big boom for the gangster genre. And we see the same principles play out again. Effects of Rodney King, right? So Rodney King was a situation where there was finally this video evidence, right? So technology advanced to the point where people could have this new technology called a handheld camera, right? People were finally able to record um, the police misbehaving. This is a time in Los Angeles where there was no trust in law enforcement. There was programs like LAPD Crash, right? Community resources against street hoodlums. A lot of people felt like LAPD was really just picking on poor immigrant neighborhoods, people that were coming from Mexico, Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, these different countries. And it wasn't until there was actual footage that people could really justify how corrupt LAPD is and how corrupt um, government was for allowing the officers to simply walk. Other instances like the Rampart scandal, and again, this all led to the LA riots and incidents in Koreatown. Um, so it's just interesting to see that after the incidents with LA riots, Rodney King, there was already gangster projects or gangster film movies that were being greenlit. Studios already knew the formula. They've been practicing this formula since the birth of the gangster genre in the early 1900s. They generated a lot of money in the 1930s, and they've been doing it every decade, the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, and a huge boom was the 1990s. And that's where we get a lot of films with maybe La Loca, Menace to Society, Blood In, Blood Out, you name it. This wasn't a coincidence, right? This was a money grab. Studios knew that they could present a product that's going to sell because they're pretty much turning people's frustration and anger into money. And so that's the real reason why studios made and invested millions and millions of dollars, because they knew they could turn people's frustration into millions and millions of dollars. So it's not about, oh, director Taylor Hadford from Blood In, Blood Out. He just felt like there were stories that needed to be told about the Latino experience and representation and authenticity. That's all a lie. It's simply a money grab. Studios knew since the inception of the gangster genre back in the 1900s, 1930s. They know that frustration, corruption, anger could be equated and sold as a movie to pretty much make money off of people's anger. So thank you a lot for sticking around, and we hope to make more videos for your enjoyment.